So, our speaker today is Tulja. If you want his full name, there it is. And okay, here's the question: Tuljapurkar or Tuljapurkar? And we can ask him, and I've asked him, but I continue to hear all possible versions. So Tulja was a professor of physics. He worked in the environment. He worked in biology and evolutionary biology, worked as a demographer. He was a visitor in the demography department here when we were next door for maybe 5 years with a KO1 award, which is a kind of award from NIH that all of our students should familiarize themselves with the possibility of. And so Tulja has a long association with the department. It's a great pleasure to have him here. He's now the Morrison Professor of Biology at Stanford and still active both in, working actively both in demography and in biology. So, Tulja.
It's Tuljapurkar. Okay, so I'm actually, I sort of have tended to do formal demography, which is the kind of thing that Ron can do. But this talk will be distinguished by its lack of equations. There are 2 equations. And it has been stimulated, of course, like many things that happen to all of us, by the fact that I am getting old. And none of us are getting any younger, even the young ones. So that, along with the fact that I spent a long time with Ron, actually, working on Social Security and other problems, and the stuff that demographers were really exercised about with respect to aging, both in this country and around the world, maybe 20 years ago, has now suddenly become au courant. You see it in the headlines all the time, and I keep looking at these stories thinking, I know this stuff. And they did then, and they forgot about it. So I will talk a bit about a number of aspects related to aging, which I think people have tended not to think about necessarily. I call this new thoughts about aging, but of course, as everybody says, there's nothing new under the sun, so it's quite possible I stole these from somebody like Ken or Ron. But anyway, here we are. So I'm going to talk about these things, and I'm going to start by talking about career transitions. And in particular, I'm going to talk about retirement. And this is not just for me, but you're going through an enormous amount of aging around the world, and we are going to see retirement on a scale that is historically unprecedented. We've just never had that many people actually transitioning globally from some sort of active participation in the workforce to something else. And the question is, how should that happen? And everybody says classical retirement is passé for the reasons that I have up there. And I'm going to focus actually on academics, and in particular academics with tenure. And it's kind of a strange thing. I've talked to academics informally for many, many years and said, what are you going to do, as you get older? And it's not entirely clear. Some of them say they're going to work until they drop. And then there's the question of the demography of academia. We are all demographers here, or have an interest in it. But academics in general, both at the institutional level, the organizational level, and so forth, we tend not to think about demography at all. I keep talking to my colleagues at Stanford, and the importance of a person in some circles is measured by the number of grad students they have. And I'm in a biology department, so we've got labs with 20 graduate students, I kid you not, for one peon. This is a staggering rate of reproduction. And as demographers know, this is not exactly sustainable. And if you ask all these grad students, what do you want to do? They say, I want to be, this is just like him or her, the person I work for. And that ain't sustainable either, so these people are going to go somewhere else. Anyway, if we have low growth in the economy, which we do now, and everybody tells me it's the new normal, then we're not going to create a lot of jobs, and so there's people. Okay, so then I started looking at retirement incentive programs. A lot of institutions have these. In fact, according to the AAUP, 32% of institutions in the United States have retirement incentive programs. But it turns out, when you look at them, that all of them have only one goal. They want to get people out of the institution, and off the payrolls. And if it's a public university, it's very often done by saying, down the road, 40 years from now, 20 years from now, we're going to give you lots of money. Just leave now. Well, we all know how that's turned out. So that's a problem. So in thinking about this, one of the thoughts I had was this approach to designing careers, which I call down the up staircase. And the usual career trajectory in academics, and indeed in most everything, is sort of along these lines. You get into the workforce, and then you start getting advancement, and then you reach somewhere in your 40s or 50s, depending on how lucky you are, how smart you are, where you work, and so forth. You reach a senior level. You get tenure if you're in academics, and then you just sort of hang around, at the same rank in academics, and very often in industry as well, and you're just doing that forever until you keel over. And this causes lots of problems, which people have discussed. So I thought, okay, why don't we think about adding a downward leg? So, me, for instance, you get your full professorship and you get your chair, and then after a certain number of years, which we can adjust, depending on productivity and so on, you become an associate professor. And then you become an assistant professor. Then you become a postdoc. At that point, you have a choice. I think this is actually, it's not a very popular thing, but especially among people in my age group. But I think it's something along these lines is really required. And I wrote a blog on it. And this has to do with the nature of transitions to retirement. I think that people misunderstand or have not thought about it very much, what it is that motivates people close to retirement. And one of the things that's really important for individuals is staying in the game. At that point, you don't really need the salary. What you want is you want to be able to participate intellectually in the activities that you're used to. If you're working for industry, you want to be in a social context, and you want to maintain that social context. You want to be able to talk to people about problems, you want them to come and talk to you, and so on and so forth. That's for individuals. For institutions, you want to be able to open up jobs and reduce costs, and you can do both of these things with that downward leg on a career. The other thing about wages or compensation is it's really about total compensation. And when people get older, if they have kids, they've already finished college or left home or whatever it is, and the mix of things that they need money for has changed a lot. So it's really more about paying for things like medical care or whatever. And I think those things are more important than salary. It's really total compensation, and that can reduce the cost for institutions while also opening up the salary positions or salary money.
You mean because medical care is covered outside institutions?
Right. So that's a bunch of thoughts I've had about.
So part of what goes on is there's the current system, there's power and there's advancement. And so the fact that the older person has higher authority gives them power. It also gives the reason for the younger person to work for the older person because there's advancement. How does this?
You have to decouple those at some point. And that is why I'm talking about the downward link. That is, you are actually, when you make that transition in rank, you're surrendering some of that power to younger people. And I think this requires a change in mindset in terms of how you think about power sharing within organizations. But I think it's something that we have to start thinking about fairly seriously. Most places, most committees, where they debate the future of what's going to happen to older people that I've been associated with, although I don't know anything about, it's mostly the grizzled old folks sitting around the table, and they're all alpha males and females, and they have power. They don't want to surrender any of it, and they're discussing how to deal with this problem, and they can't because they don't want to give it up. But you have to. It's crucial. Okay, so that's the retirement part of my story. Second part has to do with annuities, and I've been reading about them off and on. And I discovered that there's a puzzle connected with annuities, and this is a puzzle that economists have so anointed, and the puzzle is that people ain't buying them. There's also problems associated with there isn't a huge market for annuities, but people just don't buy annuities. And economists are very puzzled by this. And I thought about it for a while, and I decided I was not puzzled by it. So I thought I'd explain a bit about why. And the usual arguments about annuities, and I presume, well, let me just say briefly, an annuity is a product where you find an institution of some kind, and you give them $1,000, and they promise, until you drop dead, to give you $1 a month until you die. So then you say, okay, this guarantees me a certain amount of income, and it's a way of trading wealth now for a stream of payments. The risks that you usually see described by people who sell annuities and economists who talk about them are longevity risk and returns risk. Longevity risk is you should buy an annuity because you may outlive your money if you don't. So if you are lucky or unlucky enough to live to be 100 instead of 80, perhaps your money won't go that far. And returns risk has to do with the fact that there's a lot of instability in the rate of return, which I will illustrate shortly. But one thing that people don't talk about a lot is default risk. And I think that, well, default risk is the risk that you buy this annuity from an institution that goes out of business. And it could even be the US government at the rate things are going, but let's say it's just some insurance company and or a state government or something, and they go out of business. So, to my mind, consumers who are not buying annuities are in fact mindful of default risk, and they're factoring it in, which is one reason they ain't buying these annuities. And finally, of course, if you put most of your money into annuities, you're ruling out bequests, because you just have a little money and your heirs don't get any of it. There are ways of saying, that the insurance company or whoever will give you some money when you retire. But that usually happens at the expense of reducing the flow into sometimes by a lot. So, I went on the web, the source of all things these days, and I looked at the price of an immediate joint annuity which is bought by someone at age 70 and has some inflation protection built into it. It turns out that Vanguard, the investment company, has a link on their web page somewhere which says, if you want to buy an annuity, click here. Do that. And then you tell them how old you are, what sex you are, and you know, what amount you want to put in. And then they come up with quotes. Well, the first interesting thing is they don't come up with many quotes. They come up with maybe one or two. The one that I came up with was from this company called AIG, and it offered me this price, 21 bucks now for $1 in income for the rest of my life. That was the deal. Now, there's another company called BlackRock, which has become an enormously successful asset management company. And they have something called the CORI, which is something or the other retirement index. But if you can just look up CORI on the web, and their estimates seem to change by the week and the day and so on. But right now they're estimating that this is about what you've got to have if you want to buy in income. That much. Now that's not cheap, right? That's a lot of money, and it's changed a lot in response to interest rates in the market and so on. So then the other question is, what's your default risk? And I argue that it's greater than 2.5% because in the last 80 years, the system, the entire financial system, has essentially come to a crashing halt twice. Once in the Great Depression and once in 2008. And therefore, if I were making an estimate of default risk, I'd say it's at least 2.5%, maybe more. It's hard to assess these quantitatively, but that's a fairly, yes sir.
Well, I was under the impression that if an insurance company went broke, that the regulators would find another insurance company to take over, no, that's
Not true. If an insurance company goes broke, they can try to, I mean regulators for example, can try to sell off some of the book of risks that they carry. But it's extremely hard because when an insurance company goes broke, they lose a lot of the float that they've been using, and then there isn't that much that they have available to transfer. And with some companies like AIG, for example, which almost went out of business, they had a very difficult time laying off any of the risks during that period, 2008 to 2010. And there is no government backstop to most of these things.
Well, not officially, but in the case of AIG, didn't we bail them out?
Yes, but a bailout doesn't necessarily help the customers.
Oh, the bondholders.
Yeah. Bailouts go to equity holders, bond holders, executives.
Oh, good.
You know, there's a complex. I mean, there's a lot of people with claims, you know, perfectly reasonable claims. Yeah.
So what share of annuity holders were wiped out?
They don't say.
It's not knowable.
I think it's very hard to actually get real numbers on this.
But you're arguing that it's a real default risk. It's not just that there's a perception of default risk given economic crises, even if in the end things are worked out.
Yeah, so to give you an example, you can look at the rates of return that were offered, and a lot of companies have changed their rates of return. Instead of giving you payments at 3%, they're giving you payments at 1%. So that's an example of a fairly sizable downward shift in the payments.
But does that reflect default risk, or does that reflect I mean, I'm really intrigued at the idea that that people lost annuities when Lehman Brothers for the other companies. Well, then, I mean, we were told, for example, the bank deposits were protected, you know, for
Yeah,
insurance.
but an annuity is not a bank deposit.
I understand, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's no federal legislation protecting it.
Nope.
Caveat emptor.
I mean, I looked for one, and I couldn't find one, I may be wrong. Okay, so you've got default risk. As you approach retirement, your time horizon shortens with respect to investments and so forth. And of course, the market is extremely volatile. So these are annual rates of return on the stock market, not annual, quarterly, sorry. And those are on the bond market. This is 0 here, so the bond market is not really paying very much. We all know that story. So to me, it doesn't seem like much of a surprise that people aren't buying annuities. You have two choices fundamentally. You can annuitize now, which is what is recommended by a lot of people. They
Who are
say,
selling annuities.
of course. And this has all these problems. And, or you can annuitize later, you know, when the opportunity arises. And pluses and minuses, you think maybe that you'll get more money over, say, a decade or something, by keeping your money in the stock market rather than annuitizing it. And then, you know, you have all these additional things. So you have a window of time in which you postpone some of these risks. Anyway, I'd be keen to hear more about annuities. It's very hard to get reasonable information. For example, I looked at TIAA, which a lot of us use, and their guaranteed payments on annuities fell, you know, over the last 15 years or so. They went from something like 4% to 3% to 2% to 1%. That's, you know, fairly steady. Now they might be going back up with the change in assets, and TIA is a very solid company as far as I know. They've had no real problems. Yes?
Oh, I've just been looking at this literature for another purpose, and the real rate of return, say for example on 10-year Treasury bond, has declined from 4% in 1980 to 0% now.
Exactly.
Very steadily.
Yeah.
So those declines, are those because people have variable rate contracts, and so it's within
Some
person
do,
is
yeah.
experiencing that, or is that just that, yeah, if you were to take an annuity now, it's paying a different rate than somebody who
Yeah,
took out
yeah.
a fixed rate 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Sure, Treasury bonds are going down too. Okay.
But there's a lot of these products now which say, well, we'll give you a variable rate. I guess the ultimate question is, how much is a guarantee from one of these companies worth? And I honestly don't know. It might be worth a lot. I'm a little skeptical about these guarantees because these companies must be able to control assets of large enough size to back up their guarantees. And if you read, for example, say Berkshire Hathaway's annual report, Warren Buffett always says, the reason that Berkshire is such an important insurance company is because people know that our checks are always clear. Now, maybe he just says that, but maybe he says it because he thinks it means something. And when he says our checks will always clear, the implication is that somebody else's checks won't. The other issue about retirement, as I was looking into this, is we have a large and growing volume of money floating around. So these are defined contribution plans about 6 trillion, the IRAs are about 7 trillion, annuities are about 2 trillion. The total retirement market, which includes private, state, and federal, is about 28 trillion. And that's a fairly sizable percentage of US household financial assets, which is about 7 trillion. Because this is happening, aging is happening worldwide, there's an increasing amount of money that is flowing into various forms of savings. So that leads me to the following proposition, which is the fastest growing industry of the next few decades is, it's not high tech, it's not biotech, it's not robotics, it is separating older people. And I'm actually fairly serious about this. And you can see this, there's a steady rise in the number of, in the industry, which is designed to separate older people from their money. Some of it comes from the financial services industry. You might say, wow, surely you're exaggerating. Well, not so long ago, last year, in fact, the White House proposed these rules for people who ran retirement funds or advised them. And they came up with a proposal, which is going through, by the way, in some form. And the proposal was to require brokers, money managers and so on, to act in their retirement client's best interest, fiduciary duty. Well, that sounded quite reasonable to me. I spent 65 years making the money. But this, in fact, did not provoke this positive response from the industry. This is a quote from, some fairly high guy, that these rules would throw the retirement system into chaos. Well, it sure would from a certain point of view. And that's the reference. And as part of this, the problem associated with this, you really need new asset management models. And I'll give you an example. I had a meeting with a financial advisor not so long ago. And, I've been looking at the costs of financial advice. And there was a nice column in the New York Times about this. I thought, well, Vanguard, for example, charges you 0.3% of your assets to manage your money. That's in addition to whatever you pay for their funds and so on. And that's not bad, 0.3%. But this guy that I talked to wanted 1.75% of my assets. And I said, no.
Each year or once? Every year?
Every year.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm saying that we actually need new asset management models. We need lower cost models where the cost of management is not proportional to your assets. And index funds are a good start, but they're not enough. If you have an index fund, there are some costs associated with it, with setting up asset bundles and things of this sort. But it's not, some of it is a fixed cost and some of it is variable. And it's perfectly reasonable that everybody should pay some percentage and so on. But if you look at the costs, they are still staggeringly high. Then this concept, which comes as a shock to anyone in asset management. But in fact, if you have someone who's managing your money and he says, well, I know what I'm doing and you should let me manage your money for you, then if you don't make any money, you shouldn't either. There should be some
How else will they learn? How else will they learn?
Yeah, this never happened. The standard models are. And finally, what I discovered is that bond and fixed income investments are not easily accessible to individuals. You can do some things. You can buy savings bonds quite easily from the Treasury. But a lot of other stuff is very hard. Like if you go to the treasury.gov website and you say, I'd like to buy whatever, X amount of this type of maturity instrument. they say, yeah, we're going to conduct an auction. Please write down a list and we'll let you know. Well, I say fine. But I have no idea what the auction results are going to be like, because the auction is dominated by very large players who aggregate a lot of stuff and so on. So these things are extremely difficult. They're not transparent to the user in any way that I can easily find. The next thing I want to mention, which I thought about some, is required minimum distributions. This is something which goes as follows. As all of you are probably aware, we are entitled and encouraged, and sometimes forced and coerced, to save money in tax-deferred savings programs. And for most of us in sort of the salaried sector, that's the only way you save, right? You put away some money, and then at the end of your career, you sort of add it all up, and you say, I can buy a one-room apartment in Palo Alto and live on tofu, or whatever, But that's now, at this point, you are encouraged to think of your total asset pool, and a lot of people, sadly, do not realize that the government wants their pound of flesh at the end of the day, which means they want taxes. And this comes in the form of required minimum distributions. Hence, they must have had some demographer work this out, and it makes total sense. The idea is you have something like a stationary cohort. The number at age X is proportional to LX. Years left to live are proportional to TX. And therefore, if you want every cohort to expose its assets to taxation, they have to pull out some money every year, and this is the amount that you pull out, which is 1 over EX. And so what you do as a cohort is you actually look at your life expectancy, and then at each age, you take 1 over that life expectancy, and that determines the fraction that you have to pull out and expose to taxation, and then the Treasury takes its cut.
So,
Yeah.
if your EX is 10 years, then you take out 10% a year. What happens if you live 11 years? Because EX is just the mean.
Thus, it's not their problem. They're just doing a cohort thing. They want to make sure that on the average, 100% of the money is exposed to taxation before you die.
I mean, you can still keep the money, you don't have to pay the taxes on it.
Yeah, you
They don't collect receipts, you can put it in a different investment vehicle.
You can do whatever you want, yeah.
So okay.
So if your tax rate is 10%, then you pay 10%. This is fine, it's totally sensible. Because after all, you've been allowed to accumulate this money tax-free. I was just curious about how this worked. And I was struck by the fact that most investment advice ignores this completely. You can read the literature put out by almost anybody, Fidelity, BlackRock, and so on and so forth. And they all say, how much money do you have saved? Well, you might have $1 million saved, but it's all in tax-deferred accounts. And you have a schedule that you have to keep. And there is very little information available as to, what the right procedure is. Should I anticipate withdrawing that money? Should I start moving assets? Should I, what do I do? If I have all my money in the stock market and it's a down year, I may have a sort of perceived loss, which is much greater than an up year, or vice versa, I don't know. But this subject of RMDs is not a subject of much discussion at all. And there must be some sensible rules that one can devise. And people have started thinking about this, but not very much. Incidentally, I looked at the IRS table, and I compared it with the HMD table for life expectancy, and the IRS happily assumes that you're going to live a lot longer than the HMD says you are, and therefore you actually have, since your withdrawals are 1 over the life expectancy, It's only later in life that you have to take out big chunks. You start at about 4%.
Do you compare cohort tables?
Hmm?
You looked at cohort tables?
I didn't look at cohort. That would help some, but I don't think it was that good. I should stop.
No, you have 7, 8, 9 minutes.
One other thing about RMDs, the Congressional Budget Office has this computation, and they say that RMDs will add only about 0.5% to GDP per year going forward. Now that's good because you're adding revenue, but it is my belief that one of the things that happens as we go forward is that as retirement assets grow, they become a very juicy public revenue target. And you see this, I mean, this has happened in states for years and years. Every governor, almost every governor, almost every state, I invested with only a few years of service, but nonetheless vested in the Oregon public retirement system. And a series of Oregon's governors have said, that's our money, and we should be able to spend it. Well, it's not their money, it's my money. But this is an issue, and it's going to become a theme. You're going to see this happen increasingly over time. And finally, that brings me to Social Security. Quick primer on Social Security. You can start collecting benefits at what is called the earliest eligible age, which is 62. Then there's a normal retirement age, which now they've started calling full retirement age. Anyway, that's the age at which you get 100% of the benefits they compute according to the formula. Or there's a final planning age. And all of these are the subject of intense discussion with respect to moving up. Right? So they say, well, let's move that from 62 to 65, and move this from 67 to 70, and that from 71 to 75, or whatever. And if you look at the advice that is given to people, they always come up with this plot, which is based on Social Security's numbers, and this is the monthly benefit, which I've simply computed as 1.0. This is for the 1951-54 cohort, so you get 1.0 at about age 66. And then if you wait and you claim later, you get more per month, and if you claim earlier, you get less per month. And so this has, you can see this all over the web. The conventional advice is delay claiming as long as possible. Which, on the face of it, sounds good. Except for a couple of things. First, the increase in benefits after the normal retirement is actuarially fair. And what that means is that your expected lifetime benefits are constant. So, you claim at 70 instead of 67, but that's how they compute the increase in benefits. And I have this from none other than Steve Goss when I was serving on the technical advisory panel. So I know this is a fact. What life tables they use and so on, there's a certain amount of wiggle room, but
it's not actually really fair before the normal retirement.
it is for, except for this last downward leg. The other way. Yeah, this kink here from 62 to 63 is not. They've tried to incentivize people. Yeah.
So actual fairness means that your present value is the same regardless of when you take the benefit. And mortality is factored into that. So there's a kind of psychological, philosophical issue of if I delay benefits and I die before I get them, have I lost anything? Conditional on surviving, you actually get more. So any thoughts on that? If I wait until I'm 70, then okay, I've had to grin and bear it for a few extra years.
Yeah.
But then I actually have benefits that factor into the fact that I've survived.
Right. So the way that you need to think about this is by thinking about the risk associated with it. Right? So let's say that you claim at 66, 67, 68, 69, whatever. Does your risk, the risk associated with living too long, does that change in some way? I mean, this is the standard way people think about, say, equity portfolios versus bond portfolios. You calculate the amount of risk, and then you, depending on your risk aversion, you discount your average return by some amount. Now here the expected lifetime benefit is constant, and so the question is, does the risk actually go up or not? And it turns out the risk actually does go up with age. But even more than that, it turns out the risk is proportional to the square of the lifetime benefit, which, when you think about it, makes sense. But, so a wealthier person, that is someone with higher average lifetime income, is going to get more from Social Security, but waiting is a riskier proposition for them than a person who gets a smaller lifetime benefit. Now, there is a lot of debate about this in the literature. There are a number of papers by economist John Chauvin has just written one where he says, well, if you know that you're going to die early, then you do one thing, and if you know, unfortunately, I find those completely unpersuasive. I have done a lot of work on the uncertainty in the age of death, and I don't think we're that good at predicting it. I just have found no evidence that we can actually narrow the range significantly. And I don't know whether this is...
But the great thing about the Social Security benefit is that it's an annuity.
Yeah.
And so that might not be the outcome variable for which you want to calculate the variance. It might be benefit per year you're going to live or something like that.
Yeah, there's different ways to think about it. Yeah.
And in that case,
Yeah.
well, I don't know what it would look like.
But
that's what I would look at if I were looking at it.
yeah, or you might look asymmetrically and say, what if I live longer than I expected to?
Yeah.
Something like that. Anyway, I find it interesting that this calculation, or these sorts of calculations have never, well, either they haven't been done or they haven't been publicized, or I don't know about them, but I've never heard anybody talk about them. And I've looked, I mean, I get these, I subscribe to all these different lists, and I get a lot of stuff from the financial industry and from economists and demographers and so on, and they all talk about the increase in the monthly benefit. And they say, well, of course you gotta wait. It's not clear to me that that's a sensible thing to do. There is one other issue, by the way, one other reason why you might not want to wait.
But isn't the logic here that if I die and I get a bad deal, I don't care because I'm dead?
Good question.
Isn't that the logic?
It's such a, getting it now, right?
I mean, I have that period while I'm say I'm 65 and I can decide to take benefits today or wait till I'm 70.
Yeah.
And the present value is the same if I start today or start when I'm 70.
Yeah.
However, if I make it to 70,
Yeah.
I'm actually going to get a better deal at 70 because that chance of dying is
No,
put into the
you're
present
not.
value.
It turns out that your risk actually increases.
But the calculation at 65 is conditional on surviving to 65. And that's equal to my present value
Yeah, but
at age 70, conditional on surviving to 65. But when I get to 70, I've survived to 70, so I actually...
No, but you seem to believe that if you're 70, somehow the variance in age of death has decreased faster than your remaining life expectancy. It's not just the variance, right? It's the number of years you expect to get the benefit on average, and the variance in those years. It's the two together.
a prudent person
Yeah.
might say, I'm going to plan to live to a very ripe old age.
Yeah.
And therefore, I'm not worried about dying
Early.
early.
Yeah, I mean, certainly but here, that brings me to my last picture, which is political risk. Now, we know that from the projections that, somewhere around 2030, the system, depending on how dramatic you wish to be, goes broke, the trust fund goes to zero, whatever you want. But what it amounts to in practice is that at that point, or somewhere around 2030, the money pouring into the Social Security Fund from Texas, which is a gigantic amount of money, is not going to be able, on an annual basis, to pay the money pouring out of the system, which is even more gigantic. But it's still a lot, and you will get 70% of every dollar. And I mean, even the youngest people in this room should be able to get that unless, Congress does away with the system altogether, which they certainly would like to, some of them. But let's ask the question, is this going to happen or not? And it need not happen because there are lots and lots of ways to fix it, but none of them can be done without changing taxation. And it's entirely possible that he who shall not be named becomes the next last president of the United States, and that no action is taken. And if no action is taken, then in 2030 and going forward, you're going to start getting 70 cents on the dollar. So what happens to your benefits? Depending on, your birth cohort, this is the expected value of your lifetime benefits, because they're increasing the age at which you can get full benefits, and you're getting closer to 2030. So this is going down, and that's another reason why you might want to claim your benefits as soon as you can get them. And I have become somewhat skeptical about Congress's, not alone in this certainly, about Congress's ability to do anything which involves changing tax revenues unless it is to fund something that has a large warhead and Social Security anymore. So I think that, let's stop here. Okay. That's my cheerful message for the day.
I've got a question. I thought this was fascinating, and I think what I heard you were saying is that while oftentimes retirement advice, I think, is couched around whether or not you are white or high education, or say African American or low education, and figures out when you ought to take the normal retirement, rather declare retirement based on that. I think you were saying something about the amount of credit in the system that you have, which is altogether new as far as I can remember in this. And I would love to hear more about that. Maybe we could talk about it afterwards.
It's not clear to me that these fears about the system will come to pass. But time has been going by, and one of the things that I certainly learned when I was working on Social Security was the longer you wait, the worse it gets. And the sooner you do something, the less you have to do. But this is not just at the federal level, but it's also at the state level. And there is a huge political stake at the moment in turning these things into problems. I mean, you read the literature in the state of Oregon, and there's business roundtables and political roundtables, and all the great and the good get together, and they proclaim public employees' retirement to be a crisis or something along those lines. And they ain't talking about fixing it by increasing taxes. They're talking about a crisis, as in they make repeated attempts to cut benefits. And when I was on the technical panel for Social Security, we were briefed by members of the advisory board, and the guy who headed the panel was the former head of the Congressional Budget Office. Well, like so many economists these days, his opinions were strongly colored by his political disposition, and he and a colleague on the board pulled me aside and said, you know, we really should get rid of this system altogether. And I said, you're coming from? What are you talking about? Oh, no, the Republican Party had taken legal opinion. This was in 2005. And their legal opinion, constitutional or otherwise, was that Social Security is not a contract. It's a promise. This is, I'm quoting literally from this guy. And he said, you know, we haven't made any contract with the people. We've just promised. Promises can always be broken. I was astounded. But it's colored my perceptions of risk ever since.
So I wanted to go way back to early in your talking. You were talking about about tenured faculty and how we think about that up the down staircase or down the up staircase or the staircase metaphor. And this is certainly something that's very important at Berkeley right now. In the social science division, just over 9% of the faculty, the active faculty, have degrees that are at least 40 years ago. And thinking about how to think about that is a very important question. My question is, for moving from assistant to associate, associate to full, we have clearly established norms and practices about what constitutes research excellence and what are the grounds on which you make that advancement. If we were to imagine some kind of down the up staircase, it's not that people's research is deteriorating in quality or that it's not, what would that look like? And is there a way of doing it that's not based on age, which is of course good?
Yes, I think that the crux of it lies in Josh's point about power. And so one of the things that you can do pragmatically is you can say that anybody who has spent more than a certain number of years at tenable rank will no longer be eligible to serve on a committee of any importance. I mean, you know, we've got appointments. Well, you know, things like
Punishment or a reward?
I think for a lot of people, they will be relieved. You know, they've spent 10 years judging, you know, CVs and colleagues and so on and so forth, and it's a great relief. I'm not gonna, you know, I can't serve on appointments and promotions. Go talk to, you know, Sally down the hall. You know, she's, and Sally is 20 years younger, and she is ready. You know, and I think this is the way that you change the power structure. You change it. It's like women getting into academics. I mean, you change the power structure. Yeah.
But is the next step then the committee on appointments and whatever, then gets to change the rules and say, well, actually, we're going to put in a salary decrement? Because otherwise, what problem are we solving?
Of course you put in salary. You put in decreases in rank, and they go hand in hand with salary changes. But you see, the thing is that those salary changes ought to be negotiable. It isn't just a matter of saying, well, you're going to get 20% less. It's a question of, fine, I get 20% less, but maybe my health insurance premiums should stay the same because they're often set as, you know, in some fashion. And maybe I need more in long-term care insurance, or more in this or more in that, you know. Or I would like the university's contribution to the retirement fund just stay numerically the same as it was before, I'll just reduce my take home. You know, you can do a lot of that. There's a lot of that kind of flexibility, and I think a lot of people are quite happy to deal with it. It's just that we don't do it. Yeah, you.
All right, so I want to go back to also to that part, and then even before that, when you talked about salary, the importance of salary versus the importance, say, of healthcare, and it sort of complements my thoughts about having more options to part-time work, and that one of the I think barriers to part-time work is the problem of healthcare benefits provided, and that I think a lot of people would actually, I don't know how many, but would like to work part-time if they could get full benefits.
Sure.
And so, and then going to this retirement idea, I don't see that you need to demote somebody in status to bring them to a different kind of position. So that many faculty would be happy to remove certain obligations in order to focus on one thing, and then you basically say, well, if you remove these chunks of responsibility, your salary will go down, will still allow you to have this healthcare issue, and then maybe they can be rewarded for doing something else with all of their career, like in community service and policy, where it isn't so much, you know, publishing another peer-reviewed article. So I don't see this step down as being a requirement. It seems kind of crazy that someone who's accomplished a full professorship and all the things that go along with it would become, to use your example, an assistant professor.
You know, there's a lot of different ways to accomplish the objectives here, but I think the core of it all is that the individual's influence on the institution, on policies, on promotions, on appointments, those things that are the manifestations of rank, those are going to diminish. You can keep the rank, you can call somebody, you know, the Honorable XYZ, but, you know, as long as they are not the ones who are calling all the shots, that's the crux of it. And a lot of it has to do with, well, in universities, you know, what's the stake? I mean, somebody once described a fight between professors as two bald men fighting over a comb, but, you know, it's really control over limited resources and of various kinds, and influence over the disposition of those resources and so on. You just want to break that. You want to diminish that. And I think exactly the same problem occurs in industry. My wife worked in high tech for her entire career, and then she sort of stepped away from it, but it was very, very difficult. And you know, she's been offered a lot of jobs, and I say, well, you're bored, why don't you go take that? Well, you know, that's a rank that's not consistent with the rank I used to have. Well, you know, she was an executive vice president, and she wants to be one. And I say, you don't really want to be one. You know, you don't want all that baggage. And she says, yeah, but you know, I want the title. Because if I don't have the title, then people are going to think less of me. And I've heard the sentiment from a lot of folks.
Okay, thank you very much, Tulja.